Muy buenos días. Nos da mucho gusto darles la bienvenida al Centro de Exposiciones y Congresos para la Conferencia Magistral del Dr. David Harvey, La Historia del Capital, en el marco del Congreso Internacional México en la Encrucijada, en un homenaje a Enrique Semo. Le doy la palabra a la doctora Rodríguez Gort para iniciar esta conferencia.
Gracias, buenos días a todas y a todos. Antes que nada, les quiero pedir nuevamente un aplauso para David Harvey, recibirlo con un aplauso. Muchas gracias. Bienvenido, David, nuevamente. Quiero mencionar a quienes han hecho posible que este evento sea realizado acá en este centro de convenciones de la universidad, desde la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, en el marco del homenaje a nuestro querido Enrique Semo, profesor emérito de la Facultad de Economía, la directora de la Facultad de Economía, la maestra Rodríguez, quien nos acompaña ahora, el doctor Ambrosio Velasco Gómez, coordinador del Seminario Universitario de Problemas Científicos y Filosóficos, también exdirector de nuestra Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, y por supuesto nuestro querido José Luis Ávila, quien en algún momento fue coordinador del Colegio de Estudios Latinoamericanos y es nuestro profesor. Ideamos este homenaje y que David Harvey fuera parte de él, que estuviera acá y que pudiera estar con todas y con todos ustedes. Bienvenidas nuevamente, bienvenidos a los que nos acompañan aquí y quienes se encuentran en las redes, quienes nos están siguiendo en la transmisión. En el contexto de este congreso dedicado a conocer la trayectoria intelectual de Enrique Semo, la presencia de David Harvey adquiere un significado que rebasa el formato convencional de una conferencia magistral. No se trata únicamente de invitar a uno de los teóricos más influyentes del pensamiento crítico contemporáneo, diría yo que el más influyente a nivel internacional, sino de situar su trabajo en el campo de la resonancia, de una resonancia en específica, el de la tradición historiográfica que junto y que como la de Semo han hecho del análisis del capitalismo un problema central. Ambos autores, desde trayectorias distintas, convergen en una preocupación fundamental: cómo comprender el capitalismo como un proceso histórico concreto, diferenciado y en permanente transformación. David Harvey ha desarrollado una de las interpretaciones más sistemáticas del capitalismo en su dimensión global, particularmente a través de su lectura de Marx y de conceptos como la acumulación por desposesión, la comprensión espacio-temporal y la producción del espacio. En obras como Los límites del capital y una breve historia sobre el neoliberalismo, Harvey propone que el capitalismo no puede entenderse sin atender a su lógica espacial, es decir, a la manera en que reorganiza territorios, ciudades y escalas geográficas. Nos da mucho gusto para la comunidad geográfica de la universidad que Harvey esté aquí con nuestro geógrafo más querido, yo creo, uno de nuestros geógrafos más leído. Sabemos que trasciende a la geografía, por supuesto, muchos otros ámbitos. Harvey rechaza las explicaciones fragmentarias. Analiza el capitalismo como problema histórico real. Economía, sociedad y política aparecen como dimensiones interdependientes. Harvey tiende a formular modelos teóricos de alcance global. La relación entre lo global y lo local de Harvey ofrece las herramientas para conceptualizar estas dinámicas a escala mundial, y en ese sentido puede afirmarse que la obra de Harvey proporciona un marco interpretativo que dialoga productivamente con los estudios empíricos de Semo sobre México. Si en Semo el eje de la temporalidad histórica de larga duración, en Harvey lo es la espacialidad del capitalismo. Esta diferencia metodológica abre un campo particularmente fértil: pensar el capitalismo como un proceso simultáneo, histórico y geográfico. En términos más precisos, se trata de articular historia, economía y análisis espacial. Existen además puntos más concretos. Ambos han participado directa o indirectamente en circuitos intelectuales vinculados al marxismo crítico, han sido leídos ampliamente en América Latina y han influido en generaciones de investigadores interesados en la relación entre el capitalismo, Estado y desigualdad. La recepción de Harvey en el mundo hispanohablante, incluido México, ha encontrado un terreno particularmente receptivo en tradiciones historiográficas, y en este marco la conferencia que hoy se presenta del profesor Harvey debe leerse como una extensión de las preguntas que han orientado su trayectoria. ¿Cómo pensar el capitalismo en una coyuntura de transformaciones globales aceleradas? ¿Cómo articular teoría y análisis histórico sin caer en simplificaciones? O, por ejemplo, ¿qué herramientas conceptuales permiten comprender las nuevas formas de desigualdades y reconfiguración territorial? Quiero comentarles además que en esta semana en la que Harvey ha estado en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, primero en el aula magna, el lunes, el martes en el foro experimental José Luis Ibáñez, y hoy que, bueno, estaríamos en principio en el aula magna, pero como ustedes pueden apreciar, iba a ser insuficiente. Entonces tuvimos la colaboración de la Secretaría Administrativa de la UNAM para que nos prestaran este espacio y nos facilitaran también el transporte de la facultad, que vienen incorporándose más personas a este evento. Nos da mucho gusto. Bueno, este libro que presentó, Historia del Capital, sintetiza muchas de las preocupaciones de David a lo largo de su vida, ofreciendo una narrativa que, sin renunciar al rigor, busca ampliar el acceso a la comprensión del capital como proceso histórico. Con esta perspectiva, y pensando en que se trata de una convergencia analítica, damos la bienvenida y dejamos la palabra al profesor David Harvey. Muchas gracias, David. No. Ajá, porque el mío ya está. Baby, go. No. ¿Sí o no? No. No se escucha el micrófono.
Can I start to talk about what I want to talk about?
No.
Okay. Hello. Is this okay? Hello. Yeah. it's just the CIA trying to disrupt things. Well, I want to thank you very much for this invitation. It's always a great pleasure to come to Mexico. I think this is a lovely country, and things are getting so bad in the United States that several of us are thinking of going elsewhere, and actually Mexico looks like a great place to go. But then you get into the trouble that you're actually going to be a force of gentrification, which is not good. You still owe allegiance to the premier power of imperialist aggression. And I don't know, if I were you in Mexico, I'd say, you know, tell us to get back there and straighten everything out in the United States. But my work has largely been, of course, about the nature of capital. And I want to begin with a quotation from
Un momentito.
Okay, I want to begin with a
A ver, quita el otro micrófono. You can talk, David? No, pues dale ahí.
I want to start with a citation from my favorite author, which is Karl Marx. And it's a quotation that comes from the first volume of Capital. And Marx ventures the opinion that classical political economy, he's referring to Adam Smith, Ricardo, and so on, has come close to stumbling into the true state of affairs. But it has not consciously formulated what it has found, and won't as long as it remains in its bourgeois skin. So what Marx is going to be dedicated to is relieving political economy from all of its bourgeois presuppositions. And this, of course, is something which I value very much, and which I've sought to do in producing things like the companions to Marx's Capital. But what Marx does suggest is that bourgeois economists confront the same material realities as the Marxists, but they interpret and explain it very differently. For example, both Marx and Ricardo regarded capital as a temporary form of economic organization that could not possibly last very long. And they took the view that while this temporary period of capital domination would be very productive, it would in fact destroy the basis of its own productivity in the long run. But Marx's view of how this happened and Ricardo's view are very different. Ricardo thought the problem was this, that more and more people demanding more and more food was going to put a good deal of strain upon natural resources, and there would be scarcities. And at the same time, the value of land was going to rise because of scarcity. And the result was that the high rate of rent and the high rate of wages was going to be such as to actually lead capital not to have any room for profit. So that's Ricardo's profit falling theory. And when the profit rate went to zero, the whole incentive for capital to exist would disappear. Marx took a different view. In his view, the rate of profit would fall because individual capitalists, driven by the coercive laws of competition, were pushed into very fast and very quick technological change. And this technological change would raise the productivity of labor. And labor would ultimately arrive in a situation in which it became almost impossible to utilize it because all of the productivity was now contained in machines. Now, this is an interesting kind of question, particularly that we are facing right now, because artificial intelligence threatens to produce exactly that result, that labor becomes almost useless, and therefore the wage rate has no relationship to anything anymore. The profit rate would fall to zero, and so Marx's rate of profit argument is doing exactly the same thing as Ricardo's, except that in Marx's case, it's not external constraints, scarcity of in nature, it's an internal contradiction. And it's an internal contradiction in which individual capitalists working to maximize their own productivity produce an aggregate result which is unfavorable to the furtherance of capital accumulation. If that is the case, then this poses an extremely interesting question. Because what Marx is saying, in a sense, is it's the capitalists who destroy capital. It's not the shortage of land or anything of that kind. It's not other things. It's the capitalists who do it. And therefore, this raises the question that capitalists have to try to resolve, which is how can the profit rate be revived by a kind of set of policies which are going to revive the conditions for capital accumulation. And that then poses the question, who is going to save capitalism from capital? And that is the big problem we face right now. How? And actually, from Adam Smith onwards, from the 17th, 18th century onwards, capital was always getting into difficulties. And everybody had a theory of capital which showed that capital could actually exist without any difficulties. When the new difficulties came, all kinds of people came into this picture and started to try to understand better how the system worked. They didn't succeed. And as Marx notes, they often came very close to understanding what the problem was, but they were so tied up in the bourgeois skin, as he calls it, that they could never really figure out what they needed to do in the given situation. Now, in my own work, I'm looking at the mass of literature and the mass of institutions which are really set there to try to answer that question of how to preserve capital from the capitalists. And occasionally, some people see that that is the nature of the problem. For instance, Roosevelt in the 1930s at one point said, my problem here is not that there's, too little resources or anything of that kind. My problem here is that the capitalists are just destroying everything. So I have to save capital from the capitalists. The other person who did it was Keynes. And a lot of Keynesian economics is built around trying to save capital from the capitalists. But it didn't work because Keynes was a thoroughly bourgeois figure and hung back from the real implications of what that finding might look like when it was translated into Marx's terms. So what we have is a huge intellectual industry trying to answer that question. And you say the whole of the field of economics, all of the universities, all of the think tanks, all of the bankers and the financiers and so on, everybody is looking around saying, how do we actually stabilize this system? And if you look back and say, is it a stable system? And you say from 1980 onwards, the capitalist system has gone through crisis after crisis after crisis, and it is in one more crisis one more time right now. So they certainly haven't done, with all of that firepower and all that intellectual energy, what they've never done is to actually explain to us why the system gets into the way it does and how. So let me digress just a little bit and talk about how Marx starts to unravel this question. To begin with, what he does is to start to say, I need to actually come up with an understanding of what is capital and how are we going to actually define what it's about. Here is what he says. The exact development of the concept of capital is necessary, since it is the fundamental concept of modern economics, just as capital itself is the foundation of bourgeois society. The sharp formulation of the presuppositions of the capital relation must bring out all the contradictions of bourgeois production, as well as the boundary where it drives beyond itself. That is Marx inviting us to consider what is the nature of capital and how are we going to best utilize it. Now notice in this definition of his mission that Marx actually, in talking about bringing about all of the contradictions of bourgeois production, introduces the notion of contradiction into the argument. And in fact, what is interesting when you read the bourgeois economics, you'll never see the word contradiction. But when I look at what Marx is doing, the first analytical concept that he develops is that of contradiction. And contradiction is not something that is arbitrary. It is something that is built into the whole structure of capitalist dynamics. And I will come back to that shortly. But failure to understand the contradictions of capital seems to me at the root of the reason why all of those institutions and all of those intellectuals and all of those thinkers and so on have never been able to understand exactly why capital does what it does, whereas Marx is posing an answer to that question and at the same time using the idea of contradiction. Now this kind of problem was highlighted for me in 2008. There was a financial crisis. Everybody called it a financial crisis. It was a crisis of housing finance. And it's interesting. The first thing the bourgeois does is to say, well, you know, housing is just housing. We all know about that. It was the finance that was wrong. Well, no, it was housing that was wrong. So you're looking at the wrong thing when you start to analyze the crisis of 2008 as a financial crisis. But even as a financial crisis, there was a failure to understand where its dynamics were coming from. And there was a wonderful moment in 2008, in the middle of this crisis, when Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, Queen of England, went to open a new part of the London School of Economics and was the guest of the economics program in London School of Economics. And Her Majesty apparently turned to them at some point and said, well, you're all economists. How come you didn't see this crisis coming? They had no answer. And you know, I thanked very much Her Majesty for producing this question. And one of the things that then happened was that the economists looked around and found they had no serious answer to her question. So they literally took off about 6 months holding symposiums and discussions and all the rest of it as to what went wrong. And they got to the end of it, and 6 months later they wrote a letter to Her Majesty in which they said basically, we didn't do anything wrong, which of course, you know, is the sort of thing that Trump likes to say. But we didn't do anything wrong. But we did miss out on something which was very significant. And what we missed out on was the notion of systemic risk. Now, I'm not quite sure what systemic risk is, but the idea is certainly that there's something within the system that is generating the crisis, not something outside. And then I sort of ask you, if you were invited to travel on an airplane that had not been checked out for systemic risk, would you get on it? No. I wouldn't get on the kind of economics that has not actually checked in his systemic risk. And yet here was the answer to Her Majesty, in which systemic risk became crucial. And I'm very much alert in the last book I wrote, and which is which is to actually find out about systemic risk. What are the systemic risks inside of capital? Why does it do the negative things that it does at the same time as it does some very good things? Now, Marx was very curious about this. We think about Marx as a fierce critic of capital, but in the Grundrisse he spends 2 pages listing all of the incredible findings of capital and how the world has changed so dramatically through the new technologies, the new visions, the new visions of society and so on. So in a sense, when you read that, you find that Marx is is incredibly appreciative of capital. He admires it. He thinks that it's done fantastic things. And then he goes 3 or 4 pages later to talk about how everything in capital is toxic, how it's ghastly, how it's and this, of course, is the foundational contradiction. It's represented in our society right now by artificial intelligence. Everybody looks at it and you can list all kinds of positive things coming out of it. And you say to yourself, yes, this is it, this is it. And actually every new wave of innovation in the history of capital has been greeted by people as the answer to humanity's problems of dealing with want and need. The new factories came along and new transport systems came along. So this is fantastic. And Marx also said, and also our ways of thinking have now to get away things about religion and so on, and we have to have a pure science which is actually telling us what is really going on in the world. And our scientific findings are now fantastic, and they can, he didn't say you can be put on the moon by it, but you can right now. But then the toxicity steps in. And artificial intelligence immediately begins to look that way. It is two-sided. It has very negative sides, and it has very positive possibilities. That is the central contradiction. And the immediate response is to say, oh, well, we'll try and work on it so that artificial intelligence just gives us the good stuff and we eliminate the bad stuff. Don't think you can do that, because every form of technological transformation has good possibilities and fantastic possibilities with fantastic consequences, but at the same time has all of these negatives and will continue to have its negatives. And that's why dialectical thinking starts to become very significant, and contradiction becomes very significant. And Marx makes this kind of interesting kind of comment. He kind of said, I'm always, we people, myself and others, yes, we are interested in contradictions. They're really something foundational for us. But Ricardo couldn't stand contradictions. As soon as he got a contradiction, he said, he sort of brushes it off and pretends it doesn't exist. And so we live in a world where the real reason why something happens, the real contradictions which are there, are never enunciated and are never laid out. because somehow or other the answers are that contradiction is not a viable concept. Dialectics is not a viable way of thinking. So part of what I've been concerned with is try to bring dialectics of thinking and the notion of contradiction really back into the center of what the economic argument is about, and to try to recognize that these contradictions produce other contradictions. And this, there comes a point where the question of what is capital becomes absolutely critical. Now, contemporary economics, and I'm going to sort of generalize, tends to operate with something called a production function, in which the value of a commodity which is made, it depends upon the value of land, of three factors of production: land, labor, and capital. Notice in that formulation of a production function that capital is a thing. It's an asset which you can use. And a capitalist comes along and uses capital to go, combining it with labor and land to make something new. So the production function is critical to contemporary economics, but in that production function, you find that capital is a thing. Now it's a curious thing, because the question arises as what is the value of capital? What is the value of that asset? Well, it's a physical asset and can therefore get a physical measure. But it turns out that it is in part money and in part a lot of equipment like machinery and all the rest of it. And if you want to know the value of capital, you have to know the value of the machinery that it uses, the land that it, the factories it builds, and so on. So this is a very crucial thing for capital to somehow or other find a way of measuring what is capital, and it actually hasn't really found an answer to that question. But the thing is the nature of it. Now for Marx, capital is not a thing. It is a social relation, and it's particularly a social relation born out of exchange, and as a social relation, it is also in process of moving. And I don't know if these pictures have come up. The complicated picture is Marx's definition of capital. Well, you can see this is very, very different from a factor of production. It looks a bit complicated, but actually it's not too complicated. Begin at the bottom of the big diagram, and the big diagram has money. A capitalist starts with capital, and its initiation is money. Then the capitalist uses that money to buy commodities, and two particular kinds of commodities: labor power as a commodity and means of production as a commodity. At this point, what we say is that capital is defined by the money when it is in the money form. When that money is being used to buy the commodities, capital now resides in the labor capacity and the means of production, which the capitalist then uses to make a new commodity. So at that point, capital becomes a production process. Then the production process produces a thing, and that thing is, again, incorporating capital. But it is then sold in the market, and somebody then uses the thing and buys it. And what that means is that the capitalist gets money out of it, so that the money comes back into the hands of the capitalist, who puts it back down at the bottom again. So you go round and round and round in that way. And capital is what Marx calls value in motion. That's completely different from what the bourgeois economists would say. Value in motion. And it's in motion, and the fact is, if this system stopped, then capital's dead. The thing that is important is that the system keeps on moving, keeps on moving, keeps on moving. And after a while, Marx says, it's being used competitively. The coercive laws of competition are forcing individual capitalists to operate in this system. And one of the things that's going to happen is the speed with which this circulation takes place tends to increase. And if you look at the history of innovation under capital, a lot of it has been about speed up, how we can go faster and faster. You look at the speed of transactions on the contemporary stock exchanges of the world, and they're microseconds, milliseconds. And again, we build infrastructures, and most of the major innovations under capitalism have been about speed of contact. The automobile, the jet engine, the internet, all those things with communications and so on. So capital is being here defined as a process, not a thing. And the process takes value in one form and converts it into another, and then into another, and then into another, and then goes back into and do it all over again. But in doing it all over again, each time it goes through, it's like the game of Monopoly. You pass to the point where you get $200 for passing go. So the profit rate then becomes significant. And the profit rate arises out of the use of capital in those different stages and those steps. Now, the interesting thing about this is that Marx starts to, particularly in the Grundrisse, starts to talk about this in the form of a totality. Now, the concept of totality, like contradiction, is really important in Marx, and is underutilized because in many ways Marx did not use it in Capital, did use it a lot in the Grundrisse. So Capital then is moving through these different moments and different things, and is speeding up as it does so. And at the same time, it is producing a surplus. Now, where in this diagram is the surplus produced? It cannot be produced in the market, because market exchange is equality for equality. You must find a commodity that has the capacity to produce more value than it has. And that commodity is labor power. So labor power is the significant thing, and you work labor in such a way as to produce a profit. So that circulation process, when you sell the product and you get the money back for it, it's more money than you started with. So this system is speeding up, it's producing a surplus, and it's profit producing. And capitalists themselves become agents whose only interest is to produce profit. So they use all of these moments in production. And it's an interesting term, moment. What this means is that capital takes on different visages, takes on different forms at different moments. And this then gives the idea they're moments. This whole process is made up of moments. And it's therefore something that can be called a totality. And this notion of totality then becomes significant. So let me talk just a little bit about how Marx puts it up. In a totality, you're dealing with a system of codependence. I went out of interest back to look more closely, but I ended up actually going, of all things, to artificial intelligence to define what a totality looks like. If I can find it in my papers here. Yeah, this is what GPT says about a totality. Hey, I've got to keep up with the trend. GPT conveniently defines totality as no single part of society, either economic, political, cultural, or ideological, can be understood in isolation. Each part derives its meaning, function, and dynamics from its relationships to the whole system. It's something that is dynamic as social relations change over time. To understand why this is me, why society works the way it does, you need to understand how all these different things fit together, and that is what Marx's method is all about. But I've given you that notion of totality, but here is how Marx described it, which is pretty much close, but although in Marx's language. While in a completed bourgeois system, every economic relation presupposes every other in its bourgeois form, and everything posited is thus also a presupposition. This is the case with every organic system. The organic system itself as a totality has its presuppositions, and its development to its totality consists precisely in subordinating all elements of society to itself, or in creating out of it the organs like research universities and think tanks, that's me, which still lacks. This is historically how it becomes a totality. In other words, a totality grows, it's an organic totality, so therefore we're dealing with an organic process. In a sense, what Marx is doing here is to say capital is ecosystemic. And this is very different from a mechanical totality. The ecosystemic one is something that is capable of growth, which is internal to the system. And that growth is seized upon as profit by the capitalists. So the totality then is there. And we should start to think of the economy in terms of totality. Now, people find this very difficult in first instance, but actually there's a very simple analogy. I can look upon my body as a totality. The heart can't exist without, the lungs can't exist without, the stomach can't exist. This is exactly what the GP is saying and what Marx is saying. Its totality is caught up in this process of becoming and organizing itself. And the human body has many different circulatory processes going on inside of it. And you don't sit there and say, I don't like this concept of totality. It's a good way to think about your body. And you also know that if something goes wrong with one of those elements in your body, you're dead. But each moment has a very specific character. So you've got problems with your heart, you go to a cardiologist, you go to a pulmonary therapist, but there are all these specialists out there who do look at the parts. But there's a holistic approach to the human body in which we're looking at all of them together. And the health of the human body depends very much upon how all those parts relate to each other. But the human heart needs nothing outside of being inside of a body. The lungs mean nothing outside. The lungs mean nothing without its connectivity to the heart with it. So we have a system that works that way, and I'm proposing to you that this is the way we should look upon the economy. That there are many different circulatory processes going on, and in the Grundrisse, Marx starts to do that. And he singles out just one circulatory process inside of the general circulation. If you look at the general circulation process, you'll notice one little box which says labour power. So Marx, in Capital, starts to talk about the circulation of capacity to labour. That's the second diagram you get here. And this is a very important thing. Because, again, it's not as if labour is stopping. No, labour is moving. The whole thing keeps in motion. What is a strike about? The strike is about stopping some of this motion going on, choosing one of the moments to block the process. So, why I think this is useful is also it helps us understand something. People on the left like to talk about something called the proletariat. You say, well, what is the proletariat? It's working people, and they're working people, not necessarily the proletariat. Where does proletarian consciousness come from? That's right. And Marx argues the consciousness arises out of experience. So political consciousness, your consciousness, my consciousness, depends very much on the nature of our experiences. And then you say, well, in what ways does the circulation of labour power about taking you through different experiences? Start at the bottom of the diagram. I think it's the bottom anyway. The working person is at home in the morning, wakes up, has their breakfast, takes their kids to school or whatever, and then they go out to get a job. They go into the market, in the labour market. So the circulation process of labour power begins from the household, moves into the marketplace. Now, most people who have a job have already gone there and got their marketplace. But there are a lot of people who are doing it on a daily basis, and a lot of people who are now without their jobs and who are looking for jobs. So the labour market is the second experiential zone. And you ask, what kind of consciousness comes out of behaviour in the labour market? In the labour market, you're unlikely to be very friendly with your co-workers. You're likely to try to put them down. Those people don't know how to do it. Hire me, not them. It's competitive. But one of the things that Marx suggests is that when we start to look at these circulatory processes, is we investigate those processes. So what I would want to know is, what is the nature of the labour market currently in Mexico? What is it looking like? How are the mechanisms of people finding jobs going on? Are there ways to improve those mechanisms? Are there ways to undermine them? All sorts of things we can ask. In other words, there's a whole terrain of investigation about the nature of labour markets. But once the labour market is passed through, the worker goes into the labour process, where they have to do what the capitalist tells them to do, because they are not being sold as persons, but their capacity to labour is being sold as is individualized. So the experience of the working person in the labour process is radically different from that in the supermarket, back in the labour market. But at the end of the day, the worker comes out of the workplace and says, I have some money in my pocket. And Marx says, well, you're a worker and you've got money in your pocket. What are you going to do with it? You can do all kinds of things with it. You can go and get yourself drunk. You can go and, fool around. You can save. You can do all sorts of things. But at that point, there is the kind of question, which was also there in the labour market, which is how do how do capitalists start to utilize the labor market in such a way that is advantageous to themselves? In other words, class struggle comes up in very specific kinds of ways. But at the end of the day, the worker is autonomous in terms of the amount of money they have in their pocket. But at this point, it's interesting because you see that capital, who has paid the wages, finds all sorts of ways to actually get the wages back. In other words, there's a lot of exploitation going on in the monetary field. One of the biggest forms of exploitation is credit cards. Credit card debt suddenly becomes high. And you got that moment where you would think the experience of the worker as somebody having money will be a happy experience because they can go out and do what they like with it. But if they have to use their credit card, they're just going to have to pay off their debt. So that's a very different experience that working person has when they're in control of money and they're surrounded by all these institutions of money power, which are doing their best to get their money out of their pockets. But if they don't get it out of their pockets, then the worker takes that money and goes into the supermarket and buys food and clothing and all the things you might need. So there they are actually acting as consumers. And here Marx says something very interesting. He says when we get to the point where we're looking at the worker actually spending money in consumption, they have totally lost their identity as worker and take on the identity of buyer. And their struggle is not capital versus labor, it's versus the merchants and the like. So then that is taken, if you like, so the identity is now, so you then say, what kind of world of political struggle do we get into? What does the working person get into? And we have a sort of notion of a proletariat, and we think about the auto worker and the miner and all that kind of thing. But in practice, we're not. We're all in that circulatory process. And that circulatory process is such as that it can actually be utilized by capital to steal back wages through credit card debt, to steal back the wages by raising the prices of commodities that they buy. In other words, when you think of that circulatory process, there are all different manners of points of circulation. And we have to ask what kinds of political consciousness comes out of that. And when you're talking to workers sometimes, they will say things like, you know, I have a terrible job, I hate my job, I hate everything, it's absolutely awful, but I get enough money to have a decent house and a living environment and my household, so I'll do whatever I do just for my household. If you go to that worker and say, hey, come out on strike, they will say, no, I keep my household. So we have a much better understanding. It's not a unified proletarian consciousness you're dealing with. You're dealing with different political ramifications. That's right. That's right. This is... And then it raises the question. You know, I'm a person who is interested in furthering political well-being. Where do I go in that process? Depends very much on the situation. And what is interesting to me is that we've just had a mayor elected in New York who is part of a social democratic organization. Where does he take his politics in this system? Well, if he goes in there with an old-fashioned Marxist view and says, now, as a good proletarian worker, you do this, you do this, you do this. People like to say, oh, go off. Actually, his politics are all around consumption, affordability, dealing with, trying to make sure that as little as possible of the well-being which the worker has earned are stolen away by big pharma and big, capital and so on. And so the whole kind of question of consumer consciousness and consumerism and so on, and the forms it takes. And we have a politics, a left politics right now, which doesn't deal with all of those elements in that system. It's strictly located in this one area. You kind of say to yourself, is that right? Well, if I'm a sort of traditional Marxist, I say, well, all of that is secondary. It's not primary. My argument is no, all these elements are actually equally important, and in a given place, at a given time, there will likely be one form of political consciousness which attaches to a formation in one aspect of this circulation process. If that circulation process changes and drifts and so on, then you're ending up with a different kind of politics. Now this is where, if you like, theorizing and thinking about political activism and so on starts to come together about what happens within a totality. Because if you work on affordability of housing or something of that kind, which is in one part of that thing, it's almost certainly going to impinge upon the financial possibilities which exist through mortgage finance and all the rest of it, which is the other side. So this to me is one of the reasons why theorizing in this way is so interesting, because it leads you not to answers but to asking the right kinds of questions. And when asking the right kinds of questions about, for example, housing, affordable housing, what does that mean? How can it be produced? By what means? Can you actually have affordable housing by the free market, so-called free market? If the answer is no way can you ever get affordable housing through free market, then you've got to find something which is outside of the market in order to answer that need for affordable housing. These are the sorts of arguments you can make. But you are at that point grounded in an understanding of the totality. And the understanding of that totality is formally interesting when you think about the human body. It's very complicated when you get with a scalpel inside of it, but it's very simple in terms of what its meaning is. And I think that this is the same way we have to start to think about the economy right now, because it is doing a lot of damage. And I think that probably wherever you go right now, questions of consumerism and consumption and affordability and so on are paramount in many locations. There may be some parts of the world where it's not, maybe somewhere else. But this is just one aspect of this system. Now, I mentioned earlier then that within this system that we're starting to look at, we start to think about contradictions and the importance and power of contradictions. The contradictions are very fierce in certain dimensions. For example, when Marx is doing the work on the falling rate of profit, he suggests that the falling rate of profit, which will lead to the end of capitalism, can be suspended, if you like, by employing more workers, which says that capital has an interest, a very great interest, in population growth. Interestingly, population growth and the growth of consumerism and the growth of everything else roughly parallel themselves over the past 200 or 300 years. So this says that the relationship between capital accumulation and population increase, which actually boils down to increase of the wage labor force. Now, we've been living through a period of a massive increase in the wage labor force. Of course, there is natural growth of the population, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%. In the 1950s, 1960s, population reproduction rates were pretty high. And they continue to be high, but in recent times they've come down very significantly. There are now more than 50 or so countries that have zero population growth. That means they have less labor. And migration is going to start to become an issue. And some of those countries, by the way, have zero, are big countries. I mean, places like Italy, Japan, even China now has a problem, a demographic problem of this kind. But you can see that the demographic problem coincides with the consumerism problem. So if you want to get from Marx and a Marxist political economy to an understanding of climate change, the way you would do that is to start to look at the goods and the amount of goods which capital is producing. And that says that capital over the years has undergone a considerable increase in mass. The mass of capital in 1950, for example, stood at around $9 trillion globally. Those are the figures that come out of the World Bank and IMF and so on. So, yeah, $9 trillion. It is now over $100 trillion. $100 trillion with an increase in population from something like 4 billion to 8 billion. Just think about that for a moment and think about the stress that must exert upon the environment. Why do we having all these problems of degradation, environmental degradation? Why are we having all of these problems of climate change? There is a connectivity between the rising mass of output and the rising mass of capital. Rising mass of capital counteracts the falling rate of profit nicely. The mobilization of populations has changed. Now, the interesting thing is that probably most people don't think about it. That since 1980, the global wage labor force has increased by 2 billion people. 2 billion. You say, well, no. Well, yes. Where did they come from? Part of it is natural growth. But the big part was China entered the global labor market. Not only China, but certainly a short time after that, all of Eastern Europe, Poland, etc., etc. So there was a huge influx into the global labor market during this period, with all sorts of consequences in terms of demand for goods and the needs, things. The second thing that happened was that the demographics got connected with increasing feminization of the labor force. More and more women entered the labor force. So when the labor force was just men, it doubles up when people start to have two people working in a household. So the transformation of households and so on has a terrific impact upon the labor reserve. And the third thing is the continued assault upon pre-capitalist or non-capitalist forms of economic organization, particularly the peasantry, which has been under assault since the middle of the 19th century, but which has really become, particularly in Latin America and so on, sort of major shifts of that sort. So what you've got in the world right now is an increasing wage labour force, and that wage labour force needs to be put to work in relationship to the increasing volume of capital which is being produced by the circular kind of process. So we're now at this situation where there's not much room left. I mean, those sources of increase in the wage labour force cannot be repeated. And in fact, if anything, we're going to see a shrinkage of the wage labour force in not too distant future, which is going to put a lot of stress, actually, upon the capacity to further expand capital accumulation. So these relationships start to enter into the story. So that when you start to say to yourself, what is going on in the big diagram at every one of those moments? There's a little diagram up on the left-hand side where I talk about the mobilization of wants, needs, and desires out of an existing population. If capital is going to expand from 9 trillion to 90 trillion, then you have to think about new forms of consumption, new forms of consumerism. And you ask yourself, there's a tremendous effort right now to do exactly that. And one of the things Marx commented on about the dynamics of capital is that consumption time, if consumption times are very long, that's a barrier to capital accumulation. If we shorten consumption times, then we can go around a bit faster. And if we shorten it even further, we go around even faster. So the speed up has become absolutely astonishing. And in order to speed up, you have to start to produce things that have very low perpetuity character. In other words, you want stuff, and capital has been very good at making stuff which falls apart. And you do it, it's planned obsolescence. At the same time, you want to come up with new consumer gimmicks and so on. And you look at the electronics industry, and you see this. Now, this is not something that you say is simply about human wants, needs, and desires. It's not as if everybody out there was longing for an iPhone and had been longing for an iPhone since time immemorial and finally got it. No, the iPhone came along and it started to change people's... and pretty soon society gets organized where if you don't have an iPhone, you're not available for anything. So again, one of the things that Marx does is to start to say these things carry with them certain ideological consequences. And a final point that I want to make about this, Marx is very aware that his historical materialism is about what is going on in the real world right here and now. But he's very aware that those things which are going on in the world right now have consequences in the realm of ideology. So that a lot of the fight which is going to go on is an ideological fight. And the ideological fight has to lock into the material changes, but has to do it in such a way that it is divorced from the material changes, and the material changes are kind of put to one side in our thinking, and we think the whole world is driven by ideological consequences. Now, Marx has some very interesting things to say about this. The first thing is that as capital develops, so our social relationship changes and becomes, instead of interpersonal, it becomes a relation of abstraction. Now, abstraction is very important. The abstractions of consumerism, the abstractions of how we should do things, the abstractions that occur through the market. I don't relate to the people who've made my shoes and shirts and so on. I don't know them. But I have a relationship to them, which is a monetary relation. It's an abstract relation. You know, and people actually miss, you know, people like going to the local farmer and picking up things because they can have a chat with the local farmer. Those sorts of dependency relationships were there in very strong terms in the 18th century. But every century since then has seen more and more of these relations turned into abstractions. Now, here's an interesting question. How do you fight class struggle against abstractions? It's a bit difficult. But what we have to do is we have to understand how the abstractions are working and what is going on in the world of abstractions, and that we can then have to address them by counter-abstractions. That is what I am doing here, in the sense that I'm simply trying to alert you to the idea that the abstractions need to be addressed, and that the abstractions, if they're there, are likely to do damage in their own right. And here too we come back to the abstractions which are being absolutely created through artificial intelligence. I mean, I have no idea where this is going to end up. But you can see little pieces of what might happen in a big jigsaw. There is a big change underway, the big change which is pretty much equivalent to deindustrialization of the 1960s, 1970s and 1980s. So if we have a better understanding of the abstractions, how they're formed, then we can intervene somewhat in the nature of abstractions. But Marx has a wonderful way of writing about this, if I can find the passages in here. Yeah, here he says, as the market exchange system becomes more general and systematized, so participants acquire objective dependency relations. Objective dependency. Your dependency in the grocer is not a subjective relation in the sense that it's personal. It's an objective relation. The abstraction or idea, individuals are now ruled by abstractions, whereas earlier they depended on one another. To what degree, then, are we confronted by abstractions forged through market processes rather than exchange relations with individual persons? The abstraction or idea, says Marx, is nothing more than the theoretical expression of those material relations. Okay, those material relations, which are their lord and master. The ruling ideas are those of the ruling class. Philosophers have determined that the regime of ideas is the peculiarity of any new age. They have consequently identified the creation of free individuality with the ideological overthrow of this regime. This error was all the more easily committed from the ideological standpoint, as this regime appears within the consciousness of individuals as the reign of ideas. The belief in the permanence of these ideas, i.e. these abstract objective relations of dependency, is of course consolidated, nourished, and inculcated by the ruling classes by all means available. This was exactly what Hayek, Milton Friedman, Keith Joseph, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Margaret Thatcher, and backed by innumerable think tanks, funded by the billionaire class, set about doing. In other words, there is a refraction of many of the processes that I've been talking about in the world of ideas. And we're having to look very carefully now about the way those ideas are being played around with fooled around with and turned into oppositions. The ideological dimension to this is not independent of the material qualities. But at the same time, it is possible to start to just utilize the ideological arguments without reference to the historical materialist, and I would call it historical geographical materialist situations in which people find themselves. We have a tremendous obligation, it seems to me, to try to find out, first off, why these abstractions are occurring, to try to get a better understanding of the political economy that lies behind it, and then at the same time recognize that the ideological struggles that are building around us are of such qualities that they are actually amounting to a radical transformation of the epistemic situation that we are in. That is a heavy load to pass on to the next generation, but I'm sufficiently old enough not to have to think too strongly about it. So I will leave you with that thought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. Muchas gracias a ustedes. Do you like take some questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Muy bien. You can listen the question in English with the device. David. Aunque entiende muy bien el español. Ok, muy bien. A ver, vamos a agruparlas. Por ahí habrá un micrófono. Las agrupamos de 3 en 3. Un momentito. Ok. Bueno, en lo que organizamos lo del micrófono, quiero decirles que continúan las mesas. Tenemos una mesa en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, en este marco del homenaje al doctor Enrique Semo, donde está Elvira Concheiro, Marcela Amaro, Ambrosio Velasco, que ya se fue, John Ackerman, que todavía anda por aquí, Alex Didrikson y José Luis Ávila.
Gracias. Sí, doctor, muchas gracias. A la luz de las categorías marxistas y partiendo de este concepto de totalidad, ¿prevé usted un colapso con todo lo que está sucediendo? Estas cuestiones que forman parte de la totalidad con Hormuz, con las desproporcionadas cosas que estamos viendo respecto a los aranceles. La totalidad se prevé en un colapso por esta falta de regulación de los elementos que forman el cuerpo internacional.
¿No? ¿Ok? Adelante.
Okay, doctor, partiendo de la analogía que hizo de la totalidad como un todo.
Dos más y…
I think that first off, the connection between totality and totalitarianism is a wrong one. That totality has nothing to do with totalitarianism. It is about, like I said, viewing the human body in a certain way.
¿Les parece si juntamos 3 preguntas, ok? Y David responde.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much, Harvey, for coming to our university. And I would have, I have a question about accumulation by disposition. That is a term that you coined based on the Marxist term. But my question is, what would you say that is the relation between accumulation by disposition with ecological impact? Specifically in Latin America.
¿Les parece si otras 2 cuestiones y responde?
Pues, hola David, estoy un poquito nerviosa, te quiero mucho. Y mi pregunta es la siguiente. Retomando el problema de la lucha de clases, claro, sin tomar en cuenta a los trabajadores y trabajadoras racializadas y migrantes superexplotados, ¿podemos hablar de un proletario israelí? Y si es así, ¿cuál es su papel en la desaparición del Estado de Israel y la superación de las relaciones de producción capitalistas? Esta dependerá de su toma de conciencia, producto de la experiencia. Gracias.
Gracias. Una más para cerrar este bloque.
Yeah.
Adelante.
Hello, Professor Harvey. You spoke of this circular process, and I was wondering how violence is described into the very material relations that uphold this total and totalizing system. Near the end of the first volume of Capital, Marx speaks of the mute compulsion in capitalist relations that takes care of the reproduction of the capitalist order without the need for physical violence. So I was wondering if you could expand on Marx's idea of mute compulsion and how we could potentially abolish it. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't actually catch all of that, but we'll come back to that in a minute. What was the first question? I get these blankouts.
Thank you. La voy a repetir. Entonces, mi pregunta, Dr. Harvey, es...
Oh, yes. Let me talk a little bit about accumulation by dispossession. It originated... Marx wrote a lot about primitive accumulation. Primitive accumulation is the separation of people and labor force in particular, the separation from their means of production and the organization of a freely hired labor force. So primitive accumulation is about the formation of a new labor force. Accumulation by dispossession, when I launched that idea, it was to deal with the fact that in 2008, something like 7 million households in the United States lost their houses and the value of their houses. There was a huge transfer of wealth from the population in general, and particularly the low-income population, into the hands of the speculators and into the hands of freshly minted companies like Blackstone that bought up housing and started to rent it out at a tremendous profit to themselves. So you have the transfer of wealth in society through processes of this kind. Credit card companies are good at doing the same thing. In other words, I was looking at all those processes that had nothing to do with the formation of the proletariat, but had everything to do of stealing, robbery, thievery, and there's plenty of that going on around the world, as I'm sure you know and probably experience. So keep primitive accumulation where it is, use accumulation by dispossession. And there are situations where the two are together. For instance, China, after, say, 2078, China was actually mobilizing primitive accumulation from off the land. So what was going on in China was 7 million people, 700 million people would be taken off the land and put into the cities. So it's a massive urbanization process, and that's that in a way was very much about forming the proletariat in China, and this also applies to something like India, Israel, and so on. So let me go just one step further. In the book, I did something which I don't know what people will make of it in the end, but I confessed that Marx doesn't explain everything, and that the whole dynamics and theory of class struggle is only one part of the apparatus we need to understand how society works. And I went back through Marx to find out what sorts of things he talks about. And in the Grundrisse, he says, there's not only class struggle going on, but there's also clan struggle. Clan, it's about nation, it's about nationalism, it's about belonging to certain groups in the population. It's not something that fits with, can be explained by class, but it's not independent of class. So I think, for example, of the Olympic Games. This is a clan event. It's mobilized as a clan event. But boy, do capitalists love it. Because, cities have to invest in new sports stadia and, well, I guess you have some of that around here too these days. But clan is as important as class. But you have to understand how clan and class work together. For example, a clan government wanting to make itself rich would turn to Adam Smith, and Adam Smith would say, you want to get rich? Liberate the market. And so wealth is created, which goes to the clans, and the clans use that wealth to dominate other clans. So the relationship between clan and class is very significant. And when you get to geopolitical struggles, you have to actually put those two together. You will not get an answer to any problem if you exclude the clan dimension. But there's another C in the discussion, and that's caste, which is really extremely interesting. How many organizations are not clan organizations, but are caste organizations? Academia is a class organization to some extent, but it's really a caste structure. The ruling caste, the ruling professors, the people with the big ideas, their domination in the media, all the rest of it. It's about perpetuation of their caste position. And caste, of course, is the form of organization in the military, it's the form of organization. So if you really want to understand a society, you have to be prepared to think about it in terms of class, clan, and caste. And that you really get somewhere that way. Now, several Marxists I know hate me for saying this, because somehow or other I'm betraying the class struggle. All history is the history of class struggle. Well, I'm sorry, all history was not been the struggle. A lot of the struggles have gone on into clan struggles and caste struggles. So I think we get things wrong if we kind of keep it too close to saying, this has to be explained by class alone and class alone, because class is the only thing that's important. Obviously, class is incredibly important. You can't understand caste without understanding the way in which it uses class. You can't, it's like that notion of totality that says you can't understand without understanding the other. Marx does some of this in the Grundrisse. He was particularly interested in the form of society that arose in Germanic society in Europe. And he started to put together the whole notion of clan. And he started by saying, you know, the clan system initially depended upon family. And you know, those sorts of things. But after a while, he said, the family relation disappeared because clan became about loyalty to territory. And the whole kind of territorial structure starts to come in, and an inter-clan rivalry and wars between the clans. And, you know, I think of it and I think, actually, capital doesn't itself go to war very often on its own bat. Capital loves the clans to go to war because it can make a lot of money out of it. But so I would want to put those elements together, and that is one of the more controversial ideas I took on in the book, and it is certainly ideas that will not necessarily go down too well in the world of Marxist orthodoxy, and frankly, I'm not too much into the world of orthodoxy anyway. Sorry. Hold on.
One more question?
Yeah.
Yes, or tú? ¿Les parece si de una en una mejor, por favor? Y si pueden ser breves. Vamos a hacer, si les parece, tres preguntas más. Por allá hay algunas manos levantadas que no están, no hemos visto, tal vez. Ha tenido una semana intensa y ¿ya tienes un micrófono? ¿Sí?
Sí. Mucho gusto.
Adelante.
Harvey. Mi pregunta era sobre el capitalismo y el margen de la legalidad. Hemos entendido que el capitalismo ha creado la legalidad, pero ¿cómo podemos sostener esta base entendiendo que el mismo capitalismo es una ilegalidad en sí? Y esa sería mi pregunta. Muchas gracias.
Gracias. One more? Or
well, could you explain a little bit why capital is illegal?
Le pasan el micrófono nuevamente.
Sí, entendiendo que el capitalismo crea una legalidad en el mundo, pero nadie nos ha dicho como tal que si el capitalismo es legal. Creo que el mismo capitalismo irrumpe en ilegalidades como la naturaleza o en cuanto a las mercancías o explotación de personales. Y sé que esto es una contradicción en sí, pero ¿cómo podemos entenderlo un poco más?
Well, capital has made made a legal system which are designed to protect. For instance, you can, initially at least, if you look at the formation of human rights and things of that sort, capital has been very assiduous in creating a legal order which is advantageous to itself which is antagonistic to violence. So that I think the capitalist legal order has been accepted since 1945, but now is being overthrown. And the question will be what kind of legal order will follow it. All of the institutions which were formed in 1945 are completely helpless in the face of what is now happening. And there therefore has to be, when I say there's an epistemic shift occurring, society can't exist without some kind of legal order. If you abolished property rights, for example, and everybody took whatever they wanted, it would be catastrophic. So the question would be what a new social order would look like, or no new legal order would look like, and what powers could exist to enforce that legal order. Because right now, in the United States, every day of the week, Trump violates a legal judgment, and lawyers have nowhere to go because there's no way to enforce the legal judgment. This is the problem, and how to put a stop to that has to be some form of social agreement, and how that will come about, I really have no idea. But clearly the present system is very much on the edge. Having said that, the only thing that has been really saving the United States from, outright dictatorship has been the legal system. And as Trump would say, you have a legal system, but you have no means of enforcement, and until you do, I'm not going to take any notice of you. Whether society can live with something of that sort is going to be an interesting question in the next 2 or 3 years. I suspect the Trumpian view of this is not going to last, but I have no idea.
¿Les parece si hacemos una pregunta más, por favor? Me informan que ya están los camiones para regresarnos a la facultad y, David tiene que continuar con su itinerario, descansar un poco. En la presentación del libro que nos hizo hace 2 días en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, La historia del capital, nos prometió que muy pronto lo tendremos en su primera edición en inglés y muy pronto después también en español. Vamos a la última pregunta, por favor.
Thank you so much for your time and your words. I'm Nicole Hochstrasser. I study law here at the university. Professor Harvey, we often see the right to a healthy environment being used to justify urban renewal projects that end up displacing the working class, a process known as green gentrification. How can we protect the right to the city that you talk about in your work, so that environmental improvements do not become another tool for accumulation by dispossession? Thank you so much.
Yeah, this is, it's very difficult for me here in Mexico to pronounce on issues which are local issues and local conflicts. The area that you're talking about of greenwashing and so on is however a universal problem. But one of the things that I would want to suggest is that the root cause of a lot of the difficulty is the rising mass of output and the rising mass of investment which is available. And you can include in this also questions about population growth. In other words, the sorts of issues that are arising here have a lot to do with some of the basic issues about capital always being about expansion. And there are factions now on the left which are interested in degrowth, arguing that we need to go to zero growth society. Zero growth would, at a certain point, in very short order, actual zero growth would mean zero profit, which is the end of capital. And the end of capital is one thing, but the chaos that may go on after it will be something that I think we should be very concerned about and be thinking about. In terms of the particular struggles over, environmental degradation, gentrification, the whole problem of water management, which I know is big here, but is big everywhere. These sorts of things are somehow or other embedded in that diagram, and we have to find out ways to pull a plug on one of those moments, slow it all down, keep it under lock, so that we don't find this crazy situation of perpetual growth, accumulation for accumulation's sake, as Marx called it, as being the law of economy. And that is, again, something that needs a lot of thought. And I sort of wondered to myself, there are a lot of trained economists in this world, but hardly any of them know anything about Marx. And if they do, it's pretty negative. For me, that is part of what the problem is. It goes back to these ideological barriers and suppositions. And there's a lot that can be done about that. But Joan Robinson, who was a very close friend of Keynes and actually read Marx and wrote a book about Marx, commented in the introduction how difficult it was to present anything out of Marx without encountering just outright laughter and disbelief by the rest of the economists present. Right now, we don't have the ideological strength to rectify that situation. In the United States, I have never, ever been asked to present anything on the radio. I've given things in Brazil, I've given things all over the place. In the United States, never. Never. And it probably will remain that way. And as I try to say to them, if you really wanted to know how to make capital work, you ought to go read Marx, because he's better at it than anybody. And twice in my life, I've had Wall Street gurus call me up and say they wanted to sit down and talk to me because they recognize this point. But that's two in a lifetime. So this is part of the problem. And it's part of the problem that I would hope that you would dedicate yourself to changing. That's what we need to do. I've been trying to provide materials to help you do it. The last book, it was a very deep attempt on my part to make something very difficult, simple enough for all of you to understand, with a little bit of work. Yes, it takes a little bit of work on your part, But I've done the hard part, which is to make it easy for you, reasonably easy for you to grasp what the hell this is all about. But I don't know what will happen with it.
Thank you very much, David. We love you. Bueno, los esperamos en la conferencia, en la mesa que se llevará a cabo en la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras en unos momentos. México frente a los desafíos y riesgos globales. Está por allá, les decía, Elvira Concheiro, Marcela Amaro, Ambrosio Velasco, Alex Didrison, John Ackerman y José Luis Ávila. Muchas gracias y pues sí, ahorita la ponemos.